From the RSNA, this is the Radiology Artificial Intelligence Podcast. My name is Paul Yi, and I'm the co-host of the podcast and a radiologist at the University of Maryland. Normally, we'd have an interview with an expert guest speaker from the radiology AI world, but for this month, we're doing something a little bit different. As many of you know, this past November, we had our first in-person RSNA meeting since the pandemic started. And there, my co-host Dania Daye and I moderated the first ever Radiology AI Fireside chat with not one, not two, but 4 guests for a more relaxed kind of conversation about the current state and future direction of AI. For this month, we'll present a recording from the live event, which we hope you enjoy. As for next month's episode, we'll be back with our usual programming. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy our Fireside chat. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us here for the first annual Radiology Artificial Intelligence Fireside Chat. My name is Paul Yi, and I'm a musculoskeletal radiologist at the University of Maryland and co-host of the Radiology Artificial Intelligence Podcast.
And I'm Dania Daye. I'm the Associate Editor for Social Media for Radiology AI and Interventional Radiologist at MGH.
Tonight we have 3 esteemed guests who are leaders in radiology AI from different areas of the field. And our goal is to have a discussion about some of the hottest topics and the current state of AI in a more relaxed environment than we might be used to here at the RSNA. And just the disclaimer, tonight's event will take the place of our monthly tweet chat, which usually is held on the first Wednesday of every month.
And I'll invite everyone to join our tweet chats in the coming month. The hashtag for our tweet chats are RadAIChat, and they happen at 8 p.m. Eastern Time every first Wednesday of the month. So I'll just briefly start with introductions. We have a stellar panel of speakers today to discuss the current state of AI. Dr. John Mongan is the Associate Chair for Translational Informatics and Director of the Center for Intelligent Imaging and Associate Professor of Clinical Radiology in the Department of Radiology at the University of California, San Francisco. His research focuses on AI in medical imaging, and he was the senior author and primary investigator on a project that developed artificial intelligence for the detection of pneumothorax in partnership with GE, and that algorithm did achieve FDA clearance and is currently commercially available. Dr. Linda Moy. Dr. Moy is professor of radiology at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine and is an expert on breast MRI. She is also senior deputy editor for the Gray Journal. Her research focuses on developing AI algorithms with the aim of helping radiologists improve breast cancer detection and limit the need for patients to return for additional imaging. And Dr. Jayashri Kalpathy Kramer. She's an associate professor of radiology at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School and is the director for the Quantitative Translational Imaging in Medicine Lab at the MGH HST Martino Center for Biomedical Imaging. Her research lies at the intersection of machine learning, statistics, informatics, image acquisition, and analysis with a goal towards clinical translation. Thank you all for joining us today. So I'll turn it over to Paul to start us off.
So thank you all for joining us here at the Fireside Chat. I'd like to start off by looking back to 5 years ago, 2016, when we still had in-person meetings, although I suppose today is a step back towards that. But in 2016, Professor Geoffrey Hinton, widely regarded as one of the godfathers of deep learning, famously or infamously stated, "People should stop training radiologists now. It's just completely obvious that within 5 years, deep learning will do better than radiologists." Well, here we are 5 years later in 2021, and we're still here. And so as you think back on the past 5 years, with different developments, predictions, viewpoints, what are some of the key milestones or advances in radiology AI?
So I think that's an excellent point to start this with, and I think it's great that you highlighted that, because I actually think that one of the key milestones in radiology AI was exactly that speech. And I think that while it's easy to kind of look back and gloat perhaps a little bit, that we really owe Dr. Hinton a debt of gratitude, because I think that was probably the one thing that really focused the attention of radiology and radiologists on artificial intelligence. And I think that was really kind of a watershed moment. And while I think it created a lot of angst and a lot of concern, I think that was one of the key kind of pivotal things that got people focused on this is something important. this is something that we need to learn about. This is something that we need to, that if we don't embrace, is going to be something that is a threat to us. And I think it's also important to, in Dr. Hinton's defense, to recognize that within a few months of that quote, he, I think, learned a little bit more about radiology and what radiologists actually do and what's involved, and moderated his position on that substantially. But I think that really was, one of the things that really catalyzed a lot of the things that we're seeing going on today. I think, some of, to my mind, because, I think that really the goal of radiology and AI is getting AI out there where it can affect patients, where it can improve healthcare. In deployment, I think, one of the things that I see as kind of a milestone is the development of, here at RSNA, this AI showcase, and the first time that we did that. And then I see, even this year as another milestone, that we have this great AI showcase, but if you walk around outside of this AI showcase, most of the booths have something in them that say AI. And so I think we're moving from this point where I think we've moved to the progression of AI being something that almost no one in radiology had heard of, to something that we recognized and put on this sort of pedestal. This is this special thing that we need to start doing. And now we're moving towards it becoming something ubiquitous. It's just everywhere. Like, we don't have an ultrasound showcase or a CT showcase. It's just everywhere. And I think AI is going through that same transition.
So I'll try to, give a different answer. I would say that the biggest milestone is actually all of you here, all of us, RSNA, all these other societies, realizing that this is a tool that we need to embrace carefully, set up appropriate railguards, the ethics, avoiding bias. So I would say that, again, a big convention on this, it's wonderful for us all to share these thoughts, our enthusiasm for AI, and again, realizing its limitations. Milestones for me is actually these amazing AI challenges that we do. The idea of having multiple challenges come, being able to share your algorithm, something that I'd like to see going forward is people actually sharing more of their data, and that really is going to move the field forward. But I think most of us have realized this is new for us. Let's all learn together. Let's try to share, and then figure out how we can take the power of AI and really improve patient care, because I think that's what it comes down to at the end of the day.
So I think you've definitely covered most of the points, but I think for me it's been interesting to see sort of the classic hype cycle, right? We were very excited about what it can do, but I think today we have a much more, I'm hoping, a more realistic understanding of the limitations and what we really need to do to make it successful in translational activities. And the hard part is not the development of the algorithm. That is a fairly, in some ways, an easy part of the whole process. There's so many other things to think about in terms of, are you solving the right problem? How do you get it from a lab to actually being used? And I think we are come a long way from saying, here's an algorithm and it works well on my data, to recognizing that there are many, many, many challenges between having something that works in a lab or on a paper to getting it out there and into the hands of the end users. So.
I don't even know what the question is.
Doesn't matter, you answered it perfectly anyway. So.
Let them introduce you first.
Hi, I'm the person who got here late, and I apologize. My name is Chuck Kahn. I had a session just before this. I have the pleasure of serving as editor of RSNA's Radiology Artificial Intelligence journal, and get to work with actually all of these really wonderful people through the journal. So it's great to be here with you.
And thank you for joining us, Chuck. So just to follow up on the question that Paul asked, so as we mentioned back in 2016, there were a lot of mixed opinions about AI and many predictions that AI is going to come and replace radiologists. And frankly, there were at some points adversarial attitudes towards, between radiologists and engineers. However, over the years, we're seeing an increased emphasis on collaboration between clinicians and engineers, data scientists, to really advance the field of AI. I mean, we have many examples here on this panel. I mean, Dr. Amoy is working closely at NYU with many data scientists for mammography and deep learning research to bring new solutions for patient care. And Dr. Jayashri Kapathy-Kramer, who's a PhD scientist, on the other side, working very closely with radiologists and clinicians to bring new solutions for patient care. Now, I know the collaboration is a great idea in theory. We all know there are many challenges to carry this forward successfully. So in your experience, what do you think is the recipe for success? How do you collaborate? What advice do you have for everyone in the audience about this?
So I would have to say that I have a wonderful team. So I collaborate with the NYU Center for Data Science and then the NYU Math Courant Institute. So I guess one basic rule number one is they never meet before 3 p.m. You know, they're up all night. So don't schedule any 9 a.m. meetings. No one will come. But I think, but all kidding aside, you know, I think that they've come to realize that, you know, the importance of all of the pre-processing of the data, the labeling, and on each step of the way, how important it is to have the clinical input. So, so it's fascinating to me that I have my team now for 6 or 7 years, but some of the really basic questions, and we've developed models for every breast imaging modality that they still don't understand. So I think it's a give and take. I'm sure that I've asked them the same question 10 times, and they're probably flipping coins saying, okay, who's going to answer Linda's question now, you know, again. So I think there's a lot of back and forth, and I think it's more than just breaking down silos. It's just sort of saying, okay, you know, there's so many endpoints. You're going to get your good data set, you build your model, and now they're appreciating all the nuances of actually getting that model into clinical implementation. And even for me, I didn't realize all these steps. So I think you just have to be open-minded, you know, and just always know that you have to keep each other in check. Sometimes it's fun, you kind of egg each other's on, but I think it's really just having that open mind and being willing to collaborate.
I completely echo that, but from the other side. So we are a computational lab, and a lot of the folk in our lab are PhD students and grad students and postdocs and others who are from a very technical background. They've never seen a DICOM file, and so just the idea of starting from some complex file format to getting to the point of using the data is not a trivial task. But to the extent we can, having very, very close collaborations, weekly meetings, having people look over the shoulder as clinicians are doing their work, I think has been, both for me, myself, as well as everybody in the lab, has been really key. It's very easy as a computer scientist to try to solve the problem you want, which is great, but that might have very little clinical relevance. So trying to figure out what is a good space where you can solve the problem but is actually clinically useful, I think is something that we strive hard to do. Making sure we are asking the right questions and understanding the right problem. But we end up, if not, we end up with solutions that are not useful. And so trying to understand how the end solution might be used helps us build technically better solutions, I think. So.
And thank you for sharing these tips. And you know, along the same lines, for Dr. Mongan and Dr. Khan, in your leadership positions, what do you recommend for people who are trying to initiate these collaborations?
So, yeah, I think a couple things I'd say. I agree with my colleagues' points on this. I think that you're right that historically, you know, particularly early on, there was sometimes kind of an adversarial feeling there, and I think that was driven by, you know, many on the radiologist side out of a sense of fear. And I think so that was sometimes driven on the data science side by maybe a little arrogance of an idea of, well, we're coming in to replace you. So it doesn't really matter to us how radiologists work or think because you're going to be gone, so that doesn't matter. And I think it fairly rapidly became apparent to almost everyone working in this field on the data science side that, you know, the state of the art in artificial intelligence is not going to be to the point of replacing radiologists for decades. And by the time it's replacing radiologists, it's going to be replacing journalists and lawyers and teachers and a whole bunch of other things. And people are, you know, not going to be so worried about whether or not it's replacing radiologists because it's going to be replacing everyone. But that's, you know, decades off. And I think that, you know, then it became apparent to the radiologists that this is not something that you need to, you know, be afraid about replacing. And I think that, you know, the people who weren't willing to work together have not had much success and have largely dropped out of the field. So I think that now that for the most part, that adversarial sense is gone, and I think now there's a willingness and a desire to work together, but it can still be challenging. I think that two things that I think are important is, one is recognizing that it's almost impossible for anyone to have the depth of knowledge that they would need, any one person to have the depth of knowledge that they would need across all the disciplines that go into this multidisciplinary endeavor. So it really does need to be a team approach. I think another thing that's really important is that at the same time that you recognize that you're never going to have the depth of knowledge that your colleagues on the team are going to have in their area of expertise, it's important to try to learn something about that. So as a radiologist, it's important to learn some data science and some of the terminology, and it's important to try to help the data scientists in clinical radiology, so that, you know, if both of you are, if you're here, if there's a gap between you and your knowledge and your understanding and your language, and there's no overlap, it can be really hard to communicate. You can have a lot of misunderstanding. You want to get to the point where there's at least a little overlap there at the interface to facilitate those communications.
I just make a plug that RSNA has a huge amount of educational resource for radiologists to learn the language, learn the terms. You know, the journals have been a lot of material as well too. So after the conference, please go and look at it.
I'll stay with my colleagues here. Well, Aretha said it, RESPECT. I mean, it really just requires some notion that we respect what other people can do and have skill sets and talents that we don't necessarily have, and we work together as a team. And I made this argument actually in another session just before this, that I think that, because we've been asked the question, do radiologists need to become programmers? Do we need to learn Python to do this? And I think that's the worst thing for us to do, speaking as a clinician. In the same way that we learn medical physics in our training, not to become physicists, but to be able to talk with medical physicists and to be able to work with them. In the same way, I think it's going to be a critical part of our education as clinical radiologists going forward, to have an understanding and an ability to speak to data scientists, so that when we start when a colleague like Jayashri here starts talking about drift in a model, I know what she's talking about, and that we have a commonality of language, and we can identify the problems and recognize that AI is just a technology. It's a tool. It's a modality. It's just a way of helping us get to better care. And if we focus on that, we'll get there. We'll get a lot farther, because it's true. We can build great solutions for problems that don't exist, and we can focus on other things. But we do need to collaborate to make these things come to fruition.
Totally. Shifting gears slightly, I think we've all now seen a lot of the successes in AI. Although it's not here to replace us, it's really doing some phenomenal things. We can see it here represented in all these vendor booths. We can see it in really the cutting edge research presented here, as well as in the Radiology Eye Journal. But I think with every success, I feel like we're identifying maybe 2 or 3 or more obstacles. I'm thinking, for instance, on the technical side, maybe more upstream. Jayashri, your group published a paper recently questioning the validity or sanity or trustworthiness of saliency maps, things like GradCam or guided backpropagation, where we present these to say this is where the AI is looking. Or if we're starting to think about more downstream about quality, about safety. John, you've published some work and papers describing an analogy to how we evaluate airplane malfunctions. And so I'm wondering, for each of you, from your unique perspectives, whether on the technical side, the clinical side, or everywhere in between, what are the key obstacles preventing the implementation of AI and translation of AI from bench to bedside?
So from our perspective, there's a lot of technical issues that still need to be solved, I think, for it to be more generalizable and more broadly applicable. The question of brittleness is something that comes up a lot. I mean, we see it all the time. If you train a model on data from one scanner or from one system. It may not generalize to a different population, different scanner, different protocol, and so on. So being aware of the pitfalls in terms of translation to other scenarios is important. We see the explainability questions. So if you really do want explanations, try to build models that are slightly inherently more explainable. At least in our opinion, it's not good to go for the post hoc solutions as much. There's some really interesting work coming out of like UCSF, actually. Sharmila had shown that even for the COVID model, when they took out the lung, the accuracy didn't change, but the GradCam showed it sort of highlighting all sorts of areas. So we really need to understand what these models are looking at and what they're doing. And all of the work around the race question that had been shown up recently, where the X-rays seem to have information about the race, makes you really want to be very, very careful in how you evaluate this and make sure you're deploying it in a safe way. So the brittleness for us is a question, the fairness, bias, those sorts of things are technical questions that we are still trying to understand. Even things like repeatability, if you scan the same person twice and run them to the model, do you get the same answer? And very often the answer is no. So till we really understand those sort of at least on the technical side, that's what some of the things we are looking at.
So I would say from a clinician standpoint, we've developed models. The AUC is always, 0.9 something, but these are all done in retrospective, enriched reader studies. And you have to go back and look and say, okay, what was the population that those studies were performed on? So I actually think it's a very big leap from all these papers that we published that shows how great the model works in this very artificial environment, and then being able to really test it. So for me, a frustration is really trying to get external data sets to validate and to prove it. It's actually been a struggle for us, even with our own models, to try to roll it out into clinical implementation. There's lots of interoperability issues you have to figure out. So, it's not as simple as, okay, plug and play, you have the model that works, and let's see how it is. Even for our models that have been where my colleagues helped to annotate, did reader studies, there is lots of hesitation about whether they want to use it as a concurrent reading, whether they want to have a trial period. So I think for all of us, we're very early in that curve, and we're learning or trying to figure out whether, one, we can really trust it, and two, how are we going to employ it in a clinical setting.
So I agree with all those barriers and challenges that have been identified. And I think another thing that is a challenge and something that we're working on overcoming to get towards clinical deployment of artificial intelligence is I think that in many ways the data science perspective on this historically has been, hey, there's this hard problem of building a model. And then once you have a model, you just put it out there. You have the model, you're like 95% of the way there. And I think what probably many of us have known for a while and what the broader community is coming to recognize is that actually the challenges of deployment are at least as large as the challenges of building the model in the first place. And some of those challenges include that many of the elements of our workflow are difficult to integrate with as tightly as we would like to in order to have an efficient experience for the person using that. This is something that a lot of work is going into right now. IHE is doing a really amazing job on developing standards. We're seeing the fruits of that, right over there at the Imaging AI in Practice demo, which I would highly recommend everyone having a look at if you haven't had a chance to already. But these remain challenges to be able to, to be able to, for someone who is not part of the vendor who controls that part of the IT stack, to be able to tightly integrate in it with a seamless user interface. So I think that's one aspect of a challenge. I think that other things are, we don't have as you were mentioning, we don't have a great framework for how you evaluate whether this algorithm that works where it was trained and where it was validated, is that going to work in your environment? And the traditional kinds of ways that we would go about that with, if you're checking out a PACS, you might load up 4 or 5 studies. And if those all display pretty well, you're like, okay, this works all right. But for something like this, you really need to test it on a large enough sample that you can get statistically significant measures. And so if this is something that's supposed to perform at some sort of 90+% level of accuracy, getting tight error bars around that may mean hundreds or thousands of studies. That's something that's really hard for most institutions to take on. I think another challenge that we have is that Jayashri mentioned in one of our earlier comments that, as a data scientist, you want to solve the problem that's available or the problem that's interesting to you. And I think that the algorithms that we have available, a lot of them are still kind of coming from that legacy of proof of concept of, let's do something with the data we have available. Let's do something with a problem that's obvious and may not necessarily be a problem that has clinical relevance, or if it does have clinical relevance, it may be a small enough clinical relevance that while it's useful, it may not be useful enough to justify the cost of going through a purchasing and integration effort. And particularly because these standards are still in development, those integration efforts oftentimes can be quite costly. And then I think there's also still some open questions around, once you put these things out, how do we monitor them? How do we make sure that they, if it was working today, is it still going to be working a year from now? How do we make sure that it continues to work and make sure that it is kind of post-deployment surveillance? So I think those are all challenges that we are working on and we are making progress on, but are some of the things that are slowing down our ability to just do this right now.
I have to agree with all my colleagues' comments. I would just add to that much of what we've built so far has been very tightly focused. It's not general AI, it's very limited AI applied to specific problems. So even if you have a system that looks at chest radiographs and sees cardiomegaly, pneumothorax, pleural effusion, rib fractures, what does it do when it sees pulmonary alveolar proteinosis? And something that's completely out of the box. And the challenge is, and this is a problem that's being approached actually broadly in the AI community, is the question of ignorance and boundaries of knowledge. And it's really important for all of us who practice. I'm a body imager, and if I see an absolutely bizarre skeletal lesion and I don't know what it is, I go seek out my colleagues in MSK radiology, and I get their expert opinion on it. And part of that is an understanding that I'm operating at a level that is not in my comfort zone, and I'm, not seeing anything where the probability of diagnosis is exceeding 0.9. AI systems have problems with that. They go blindly charging in and saying, this lesion has a probability of 0.04, and everything else is 0.01, and so that's my diagnosis is the thing that's most likely. And it's like, no, that may not be the case. And so I think one of the challenges for us all is to maybe just take a little bit of a deep breath with many of these things. We want to move the science forward, but also recognizing that it can do some things for us in the here and now that are very effective, help us tag lung lesions and do volume on them and track them over time, that it can help us find patients who are going to likely no-show, or help us improve, reduce the dose on CT or the time that a patient spends inside the MRI scanner. We can use the technologies to do many of these things today, and the other things will follow as we gain experience and as our depth of understanding of the technology grows. And I only add just, for those of you who are old enough to have been around when MRI first came around, I was born, of course, when Röntgen was, no, just kidding. But when MRI first came around, everyone said we will never need to biopsy anything ever again. This not only will tell us if the lesion is cancerous or benign, it will give us the exact metabolic profile of the tissues, and we had extremely high hopes for what MRI could do. Is MRI a useful tool to us today? Absolutely, yes. But some of that was unnatural hype that people put behind it. And I think we see a lot of that in radiology today. So again, just, I'm enthusiastic about a lot of things, but I temper my enthusiasm about some of the things people are doing with AI.
So Chuck, you mentioned something about the here and now, and so I know we're taking things with a grain of salt, but we can see that things are being deployed clinically. And John, I know UCSF just announced some really exciting news that this algorithm that was validated in a really robust multi-center study for detecting coronary artery calcium scores is actually being deployed clinically. So one question I think that's relevant probably to all radiologists in this room, whether you're involved with AI research or not, is what if AI makes a mistake? What if AI gets it wrong? Who's liable? Is it the radiologist? Is it the practice? Is it the hospital? Is it the computer programmer? I'm curious if you have any thoughts, anyone, but maybe starting off with John, since he probably has the most direct experience right now.
So I think that's a really interesting question. I think it's something that we're all kind of wondering about. I think there's a couple aspects to that. I mean, when we're talking about liability, that's a legal question. So obviously, I'm not a lawyer, but I think that as a legal question, that's probably not really fully established. I'm sure there are precedents that if I were a lawyer, I could, draw to, but I think that will probably be something that will be established in case law over the course of, the next 5 to 10 years or so. I think based on what little I know of what the precedents have been in the past, that I doubt that physicians and radiologists will be absolved of responsibility. In general, physicians and radiologists are considered to, for the care of the patient, the ultimate responsibility lies with the physician. And in general, they are assigned a large chunk, if not all, of the liability. So I think that should be our expectation. But I think, leaving aside the legal question of liability, I think there's another question of responsibility. So, legally is, who's going to get blamed and who's going to have to pay a penalty. But responsibility, I think, is leaving aside what the law says, who should be, taking responsibility, who should be making sure that, and, I think that they're really, the majority of it does rest with us as physicians. I mean, that's the job that we took on, to make sure that we're responsible for our patients' care. And so I think that, as part of that, it behooves us to really carefully consider what, the quality of the algorithms that we're putting into practice, to make sure that we understand how they were trained, what data they were trained on, how similar that training and that training population and the populations that they were validated on look to our patient population, both in terms of, demographics and in terms of disease prevalence, and to make sure that not only the way that the algorithm itself works, not only that we're comfortable with the way that the algorithm works, but that we're also comfortable with the way that it's integrated into our workflow. So is this an algorithm that's going to be integrated in a way that the results of it are going to go directly to influence how patients are going to be cared for, or is this something that's going to be advisory and come through a radiologist? And if it's going to come through a radiologist, how much ability does the radiologist have to verify that the results that they're getting are correct? Is it going to be obvious to the radiologist when that algorithm is failing? Or is it the algorithm doing something that a radiologist doesn't know how to do, like image reconstruction, where it may be less obvious when it's failing? So I think that it's for all these reasons that we really, regardless of how the liability question ends up being settled, that we really need to take responsibility for the performance of these algorithms when we're implementing them clinically.
I'm just going to give a old example. So I am a breast imager by training, and we have these CAD systems that were developed. And when it first came out, we had lots of issues about, okay, do you want to save these prompts or not? Should we just go ahead and just do away with them? And it turned out, that yes, ultimately it is the radiologist who is responsible. You weren't protected if you missed a cancer and the CAD didn't highlight it. You couldn't say, oh, CAD couldn't find it, therefore I couldn't, so therefore, I'm not liable. That did not hold up in court. In the corollary was true, where, I made a better case, and there was a prompt, and I chose to ignore it, So I think at the end of the day, as a physician, we take this oath to take care of patients. I don't know if other parties would be pulled into some sort of lawsuit, but I agree with John. At the end of the day, the radiologist is going to be, the main person who is going to be responsible for using the AI product.
I'm very glad that I have no responsibility in this whatsoever.
Wow. Wait, the system is obvious. Oh, hold it up here. Oh, okay, thank you. When Willie Sutton was asked why he robbed banks, he said that's where the money is. And if the question is who's going to be sued, it'll be where the money is. It'll be the radiologist, it'll be the health system, and it'll probably be the AI developer, builder, vendor too. But not Dr. Kalpathy Kramer.
So switching gears a little bit, but keeping on the topic of data, some of the more controversial issues right now in AI is around privacy and data ownership. So who owns the data, or who should own the data?
To some extent, I guess it depends on where you are in the world, because custom and law dictates different things in different places. In the European Union, persons in general have a right to be forgotten. Your data not to be stored or used without consent. And I think a lot of us have been sensitized in the U.S. as well with the notion that if you're going to use data from patients that such information, even when you're looking at 100,000 chest X-rays, to what do we owe to any individual patient in using that to build an AI model? And I don't know. I'm not a lawyer either, and I don't know what the expectation is there. But many institutions now include a blanket, some statement within the general consent form that the patient signs, in the same way that we allow cases to be used for teaching purposes, that they come into our hospitals and understand they're going to be seeing students of medicine, in the same way that their data may be used in some way that has been reviewed ethically, but is intended to further the goals of developing health. But it gets very tricky when you start connecting that with money. If I'm just building an AI model in my institution, it's one thing. If I'm going to use that and sell it in the marketplace, it really becomes a more complex question, I think.
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and I think that, again, as you said, there's two questions: who owns the data, a legal question, and who should own the question, a sort of moral and ethical and philosophical question. And there is established law in every state in the country as to who owns the data. It varies actually quite a bit from state to state. It's also, I think, the case that the laws in most states are not necessarily in alignment with what the people of that state might expect. And I think this is because historically it hasn't really mattered. The data has been a bunch of, almost illegible scribbles on paper in filing cabinets in a dusty basement somewhere, and no one's really been that concerned about who owns it because it hasn't really had a whole lot of value. Now we're entering a world where that data all of a sudden has a lot of potential value. And so I think that we're likely to see some changes in the future in who owns the data, as this comes more to the forefront, because now people care. Now it matters to people. And I think that there are a lot of aspects of this. I think that it's important for us as a radiology community, as an AI community, to try to communicate to the general public that this value is, not just a way for some companies to get rich, but this is a value to society, that if we decide to set this up in a way where each person individually owns their data, and the only way you can assemble a data set is by individually getting, 100,000 people to sign something, which is an insurmountable task, then we as a society will be denying ourselves the benefits that can come from, that can come in terms of improved healthcare from artificial intelligence. And I agree with what Chuck said, that it definitely gets sticky once people start talking and thinking about money and recognizing that, oh, well, there's some company that's going to sell this and that's going to make profits off of this. But at the same time, I think it's also important to recognize that nothing in medicine really has broad impact until there's a company behind it. Like, there are very few hospitals and medical centers in this country, in this world, that are going to download an AI package off of GitHub and stand it up in their data center. Like, that's just not the way, maybe there's a few academic centers that might do that, but that's just not the way that, there's no community hospital out there that's going to do that. And so you have to have companies that are standing behind these things, that will sign contracts and provide support. That's the only way that this ever has a broad impact on actually improving the way that we deliver radiology and healthcare.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we are, as you said, in a brand new era of data ownership and defining who owns and who should own the data. And focusing a little bit more on data privacy. I know this has been a big issue in AI, especially after all the data with CT image reconstruction for the facial features, etc. I mean, in your opinion, what are some of the biggest pitfalls for data privacy in AI, and how can we address them?
Oh, no, Yikes. Well, there are, we'll start with, as many of you know, you can take, if you have an imaging of the head, MR or CT, you can render a nice 3D facial profile of that, which can be then used to match against driver's license photographs. And you can do that very effectively. So that's one way of kind of breaking, There are a number of concerns. We've done some work at our place looking at radiology reports and the challenges of de-identifying them. I will tell you, it's actually very time consuming. The amount of PHI, of protected health information like names, dates, and so forth that's present in radiology reports is actually relatively small, at least in the sample that we looked at. Most of it was date information. I think only 6% of exams had names, is my recollection. But even that, obviously, you don't want that to leak through. And there are techniques with text data to do things like, if you see a name and it says Charles Kahn, well, you might change that into Luke Smith. It's called hide in plain sight. You kind of take a name and you change it. But there are actually even ways, very clever people have found, that you can provide a tax against that and figure out what the underlying things were, and if something has been changed into a pseudonym. So not only the text is a problem, but for people who have released data sets, like when the NIH put out that 110,000, 140,000 array of chest radiographs, they estimate it cost about $1 per image, because they all had to be reviewed by humans, because we have this problem that images not only may have someone's name, burned into the image in the corner. Someone can be wearing a necklace that has their, we've seen, the necklace that says Julie, and you'll see that in an image. People who have implants, like a pacemaker, you can read the serial number on a radiograph. And so all of these things, are just ways you have to think around it. And, for those of you who are familiar with DICOM, you know that DICOM has specific fields that carry the PHI. But there are private tags. And so every manufacturer can put stuff, whatever they choose, in a private tag, and that private tag might include the patient's name, medical record number, home address, phone number, social security, and so it really becomes a very detailed effort to try to assure that that information is stripped out, and where we use this information, we use it judiciously.
So I completely agree with all of Chuck's points and examples. And, PHI can hide and will hide in the strangest places. But I think another aspect of the sort of pitfall here is, from looking at from the other perspective, is I think one of the pitfalls sort of or barriers in terms of being able to do work, being able to accomplish improvement in healthcare by assembling these data sets, is that we're in an environment where the standard of de-identification is 100%. And because there, are all these places that, that PHI can hide, in someone's jewelry, or, is the pattern of degenerative changes in someone's spine, is that a unique identifier? It probably is. If you show, in some sense, like if you show me a spine and then another spine, I can probably tell you, yeah, that looks like it's the same person. So, I think another thing that we need to start to think about and address as, as radiologists and as a broader society is 100% the right threshold for what de-identification should be? Because if that's where we draw the line, then it makes assembling these data sets oftentimes prohibitively expensive. And we are going to a large extent, bar ourselves from making these advances, and depending, different countries may draw the line at different thresholds, and it's likely that the countries that draw the lines at very high privacy, this is a trade-off. Like, there are advantages to very high privacy, and I'm not sure where the answer is here, but countries that say that absolute privacy is the first thing, everything 100% private, and then once we've achieved that, then you can do the other things. They're not going to advance as fast with these technologies. So I think we need to think about privacy as not just purely something that should always be 100%, but as something that has a trade-off and has benefits and costs.
I want to make a quick comment before Chuck answers. So we've developed a very big breast ultrasound data set. I think I presented some data. It's about 5.4 million images, and we've published, and many groups have come to us saying, can you share a little bit of that data set? And actually, we wanted to, but as what John alluded to, the cost of us going through each image, making sure that every single PHI was removed, is so prohibitively expensive that we were not able to offer that.
So what all of do faced with a situation where something happens infrequently, big consequences? We buy insurance, right? I mean, we buy. This thing really doesn't like me. Oh, it's okay. But the question is, could you have an insurance program that says, okay, we are going to de-identify these images, and I will guarantee that 95% of are clean. Wow. Maybe, wow, weird. But maybe the issue is for that one or two that might leak through and cause a $10,000 per incident HIPAA penalty. Can I just cover that with an insurance policy? Because if I'm looking at 1 million images and I figure that I'm going to have 10 leak through, is having a policy that costs me $100,000 or $150,000, is that cheaper than spending $1 for every one of those 1 million cases? So, but nobody's going, believe me, nobody's going there, and nobody wants to appear in an article on the cover of the New York Times that says, oh yeah, we thought we would cover the monetary damages, and we didn't care about the privacy of our patients, and nobody's going to do that. I guess the other thing is we do federated learning, right? We don't ever share the images and data outside of our own institution. We just pass the model around and let it be trained at the different sites, and keep the data under wraps.
I think we also need to be somewhat rational in thinking about what it means to be private. I think we tend to, I don't know if anybody has the answer, but I think we always hear of the most extreme cases of re-identification, but that makes assumptions that you have access to everything about that person, including their pacemaker number or whatever. And so I think we need to have a very rational conversation about what privacy means. And from every conversation I've had with the radiologists, they seem to be able to look at a picture and know who it is without, they remember all their patients. They can look at a pic, and this was this patient, and they know everything about them. And it's like, what do we mean when we are stripping that image of information? So,
I was just going to add that recognizing that Google and or Apple seems to know exactly where I've been over the last several years and knows what I search for and what whose brand of shirts I buy, and we even putting our faces into the social media, they tend to get scanned, they get analyzed, we get classified. There is a lot of information that we very readily give up to various companies. And how many of you really read the details of the legal agreement, the terms of use, before you clicked agree and started, using Facebook? But these are some of the challenges that we all have going forward with this. It's a great question, and as much as we talk about things like the tragedy of the commons, right, where you have something that's meant for common use and often gets kind of degraded, there's also this sort of loss of opportunity of the commons. I think it was John was talking about, that if we don't, as a society, organize to recognize the value of some of this information, that we lose our ability to gain it and apply it and use it for the greater good.
I also think it's important to bring the patient perspective into all of this, right? We are sitting here as not the patient, but I think depending on who you ask from the patient perspective, you can get a much more generous viewpoint on how their data can or cannot be used. So I think it's worth bringing them into the conversation as well.
Absolutely, I could not agree more with that comment. I know there's a lot of interest right now in adding patients to the AI governance boards at
Right.
most academic centers to address that point. So that point is very well taken.
So we're heading into the last few minutes of our time together. So maybe as a closing word from each of our panelists, what are you most excited about with AI in radiology now in 2021? And what are you excited about maybe coming down the pipeline in the next 5-10 years? What's the next frontier?
I'm going to give you a really odd answer. I think one of the things that AI that's really exciting about it, that it's going to do for us, is guide us to normal. Right now, well, I'll give you one quick example. Many of you know we had the Pediatric Bone Age Challenge, which was the very first of the AI competitions that radiology held. Well, that Pediatric Bone Age uses an atlas called Greeley and Pyle that was compiled in the 1930s based on some 300 children in suburban Ohio, all Caucasian. Is it a really useful reference? Maybe not. So one of the things people have done is to take radiographs of kids coming into an emergency department, getting hand radiographs, and using that with their chronological age as a way to establish norms for patients, and actually making it data-based. That gives us a data set that we can use instead of looking at a reference textbook. Similarly, we had an article published in the AI journal that measured the cross-sectional area of the neural foramina in the lumbar spine. Nobody is going to measure every one meticulously, but it allows you to create a range and understand what is normal for a 65-year-old male as opposed to a 35-year-old female. And maybe it has to do with the patient's height. And you can imagine all manner of things that we take as imaging phenotypes, as information that lets us then make a decision to say, well, that neural foramen, if that's a 65-year-old male, that's at the 45th percentile, that's normal. If that's a 35-year-old female, that's at the 5th percentile, that's abnormal and something to actually have a surgical consult. So these are some of the things I think that we can begin to use the technology for, and actually that kind of, I think it gets us towards precision medicine. It's one of the things I'm really excited about.
I'm actually excited about increasing access to care worldwide. I think that there are so many parts of the world where there's just not enough clinicians, and I'm really hoping that we can start to address that. I'm excited about these sort of almost population level or epi level things that AI can do. And quality and safety is another area where I think, again, it's huge opportunities for AI. So I think it doesn't have to be perfect to make an impact in many of these areas. And I think starting with some of the lower risk areas might help us build enough trust that we can then transition to the more high risk areas. So.
I want to build upon what Jayshree said about really trying to equalize the healthcare disparities in the world. So yes, you could develop great AI models who can then read images remotely, but something that we've just developed a partnership with is actually training people who have very minimal training, how to position the probe to take ultrasound pictures, take, mammograms, take all these tests, and then really being able to kill the birds of having, the technical expertise to perform the studies, and then being able to read it, and then really being able to say, okay, we can provide a relatively standard level of healthcare across all countries, irrespective of the wealth of the country and whether the patients can pay.
What I'm most excited about, and what I'm looking forward to in the next couple of years, is really moving from the point where at conferences like this and at panels like this, we stop talking about the potential of artificial intelligence, and we start realizing that potential. We start actually seeing impacts and talking about the impacts and measuring those impacts and recognizing the challenges that I talked about earlier and actually getting these things out into clinical deployment. I think that these are hard problems, but these are problems that we're working on, that we're making a lot of progress, and I really feel like we're poised right on the brink of this kind of real translational revolution of bringing these things out of the lab, out of the data science bench, if you will, which is really probably a laptop in a coffee house somewhere, and into the clinic, into the reading room. And I think we're seeing that again with the AI imaging in practice demonstration we have here, with a special issue that's going to be coming up in Radiology AI in March on AI in practice. And that's what I'm most excited about, is these ceasing to be a purely theoretical thing or a mostly theoretical thing and means something that just is ubiquitous in our everyday practice, improving the lives of radiologists and patients.
All right, well said. Thank you again to our panelists for joining us here for the AI Fireside Chat. Thank you to our audience also for joining us. This will be the conclusion of our session. We just want to make a shout out to our monthly tweet chat. If you can follow us on Twitter at RadAI. Hashtag RadAI Chat. And if you like what you heard here, please check out our podcast on Spotify, Apple, and wherever else you can get podcasts for monthly episodes. So thank you again. I hope you enjoy the rest of the meeting. We hope you enjoyed listening to the first ever Radiology Artificial Intelligence Fireside Chat. As always, thank you for tuning in. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe and rate us on Spotify, Apple, Google, or wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us reach a wider audience. And if you have any topics you'd like us to cover, please message us at podcasts@rsna.org. Until next time, stay safe and healthy.